Imagine biting into a crust of bread fried in lard rendered from animal dung, the texture crisp, the aroma somewhere between death and warmth. For starving peasants, it was salvation. Today you will learn how medieval people survived using the fattiest, smelliest, and most bizarre snacks, like blood sausage, rotten fish paste, and fried bread in dung fat, to endure war, famine, and the harsh reality of daily life. Dear viewers, my big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you subscribe, I'll keep creating even more fascinating and unique videos about life in the Middle Ages. And with your support, we'll get closer to that goal. I'm truly grateful to everyone who's helped me along the way. Now let's move into today's video. Long before powdered rations and protein bars, the marching men of medieval Europe carried something far more primitive and far more pungent. In a world where bread was often stale and meat a luxury, soldiers and peasants alike turned to a survival food that modern noses would never forgive: hardened crusts soaked in fermented fish sauce. Garum, sometimes called alec in the Slavic lands, was the foul-smelling lifeblood of these strange medieval snacks. Born of ancient Roman culinary alchemy, it had survived the empire's collapse and lingered through the centuries, finding its way into the packs of crusaders and the bowls of Benedictine monks. To make it, fish guts were packed into clay or stone vats layered with coarse salt and left to rot in the sun for weeks. The bread soaked it up like a sponge, transforming its dusty crumb into something slick, sticky, and deceptively energizing. To the uninitiated, the smell was nearly unbearable. The sour stench of rotted fish mingled with salt and age, igniting the throat and curling the stomach. But for the hardened footmen of the Holy Roman Empire or the marching legions of Hungary, it was an instant calorie bomb, rich in proteins, fats, and salt, a blend that clung to the ribs and kept limbs moving through the mud. Archaeological excavations in southern Italy and around Cluny have unearthed traces of this sauce sealed in ancient pottery, chemical analysis revealing remnants of anchovy oils, herring bones, and sardine scales. Some even suggest that monastic cooks preserved the recipes for generations, handing them down as one might hand down scripture. And no wonder. A flask of garum could last months, needed no fire, and offered both flavor and sustenance in times of scarcity or siege. During imperial campaigns, especially under the German emperors pushing eastward, soldiers marched with belts of dried bread and pouches of garum paste wrapped in cloth. Otto of Freising, the 12th century historian bishop, wrote that troops storming across the Hungarian plains would breakfast on this fetid mash before drawing swords. He claims the sauce burned the tongue and stirred the blood, as though fire had kissed the throat and stiffened the sinews. In battlefield conditions, the ease of preparation mattered. Makeshift ovens were dug into the dirt or built from clay near the fire, the loaves emerging blackened and hard but serviceable. The garum was applied cold. If it had to be warmed, it was often set beside the forge or laid in the embers until it hissed. And when it hit the bread, the smell rose in curls, sharp, oily, acidic. New recruits often gagged at their first taste, but the body learned quickly. After a week on thin barley broth and stale oats, the fish fat-soaked bread was divine. It became ritual, eaten before battle, shared at night beside the fire, remembered in letters home not as horror but as comfort. In war, taste softened pain, and for those who could not afford meat, garum was the closest thing to strength in a bottle. Among monks and military cooks, additions appeared: chopped green onions, crushed garlic, wild herbs. These masked the odor, eased digestion, and reflected a growing awareness of the sauce's dangers. Fermentation could go wrong. Too little salt and the paste soured. Too much sun and it turned toxic. Chronicles speak of entire detachments struck down by tainted garum, groaning in the grass while enemies circled. Yet still it endured. In castles, under siege for weeks or months, it was smeared on bread and served with pickled roots. In villages, it appeared beside sour ale and raw leeks. It was more than a food. It was a habit, a shared ordeal, a flavor of endurance. The peasant with a heel of bread and a splash of garum could face another cold dawn in the fields. The knight, girding for war, found his courage not just in prayer, but in the fire that seared his throat and settled warm in his belly. Garum became a symbol, a foul-smelling relic of Roman science, a pungent badge of monastic thrift, and an unsung hero of medieval survival. It dripped down cracked crusts, soaked into trembling fingers, and left its scent on lips long after the meal had passed. It was black as pitch and coiled like a serpent, glistening with steam from the iron pan where it had just been crisped. No medieval feast was complete without it, but its true place was not on the banquet table. It was in the hands of warriors, clutched tightly before battle like a talisman of strength. This was no ordinary food. It was black pudding, blood sausage, a dish that carried within it more than calories. It carried fear, courage, and the memory of the hunt. The ingredients were brutal in their simplicity: fresh animal blood, clumps of rendered fat, ground grains, chopped herbs, and salt. Sometimes garlic or onion was added, sometimes barley or millet, depending on the region and season. But always the life fluid was the base. Still warm from the carcass, stirred slowly so it would not clot, the blood was transformed from horror to sustenance by hands that had done it 100 times before. In times of war, monks and peasants alike treated blood as treasure, not a taboo, but a sacrament of survival. In England, the black sausage was formed with oats or barley. In Normandy, it absorbed crushed almonds and raisins, a vestige of Arab influence traded from the south. In the Rhineland, herbs like marjoram and wild thyme turned it into something close to a sacred paste. These regional differences mattered little in the end, because the purpose was always the same: energy-dense, iron-rich, and spiritually fortifying. It was a meal that stuck to the bones and summoned the heat of life. The process of making it was a study in balance, between rot and nourishment, between death and utility. The blood had to be drained properly, cooled just enough, and strained of clots. The fat, usually marrow or suet, was chopped fine and blended with cooked grains. Then came the mixing, slow, steady, almost reverent, before the warm, viscous mass was poured into cleaned intestines. These were tied carefully, not too tight, and simmered gently over fire. One misstep, one burst casing, and hours of labor would dissolve into the ashes. Cooked to perfection, the black coils were laid out to rest and thicken. Then, when the time came, they were sliced thick and seared again, often over open flame, until the edges turned crisp and the inside bled a rich, savory oil. The smell was unforgettable, earthy, spicy, faintly metallic, the kind of scent that could linger on fingers and steel alike. In campfires before dawn, knights passed them around like relics. In monastic kitchens, they were laid on wooden boards beside dark bread and sour ale. But in the field, they took on their most powerful meaning. Chronicles from the Welsh marches speak of commanders dividing blood sausages among their troops before a desperate uphill charge, as though feeding them pieces of courage. One 14th-century poem calls it the black ball of life, noting its round shape, its heaviness, and the way it seemed to arm the soul against what lay ahead. Blood sausage wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual, a moment of silence before the scream. A soldier gnawed at the casing, swallowed the heat, and steeled himself for violence. Even among commoners, it held meaning. During harsh winters or long treks between towns, peasants would boil what scraps they had and mix the blood of a slaughtered pig with whatever grains were left. The resulting coil would be shared sparingly, each slice a rare moment of strength in a diet otherwise ruled by porridge and despair. But it was not without danger. Improperly cooled or undercooked, it could sicken a man. Too much at once, and the gut revolted. Monastic rules in Cluniac records even warned against excess. Too heavy for the mind, they said, too warming for the soul. For those sworn to spiritual clarity, blood was a risk, not only physical, but moral. And yet, even these cautious orders allowed it in times of hardship, suggesting a quiet acknowledgement that spirit alone could not feed the body. Archaeologists at Greasy found shards of clay pots still laced with traces of blood and marrow, their chemical signatures confirming the presence of iron and specific amino acids found in bone fat. This wasn't guesswork. This was practice, repeated generation after generation, passed through war, famine, and plague. The blood sausage endured not because it was pleasant, but because it worked. It fed, it fortified, and it reminded those who consumed it that life could come from death if only one dared to eat it. For the medieval warrior, strength was not measured in muscle alone. It was measured in what he could stomach, in the black paste that oozed warmth into frozen limbs, in the thick iron tang that made him gag before it made him stand tall. And so the sausage passed from hand to hand, bite to bite, like a dark Eucharist for a world without mercy. In some towns, leftover links were dipped in vinegar and distributed to the poor. There were no leftovers in a medieval kitchen, only hidden treasures waiting to be unwrapped. When a beast was slaughtered, no part was wasted, not even the parts that twitched after death or looked back at the butcher with a final glassy stare. From the slender curve of a chicken's neck to the thick, muscular tongue of an ox, these humble scraps were not discarded. They were transformed. With fire, fat, herbs, and patience, they became bold, greasy, unforgettable snacks that fed both the desperate and the refined. The neck of a chicken, though modest in size, carried a paradoxical appeal. It was bone-thin, sinewy, ringed with fragile muscle and slick skin. Yet it was precisely this structure, tight, pliable, stubborn, that responded so beautifully to slow heat. In rural homes, these necks were reserved for feast days or special winter meals, when an animal was killed and every edible thread had to be honored. After plucking and cleaning, the necks were soaked in a mixture of vinegar, garlic, salt, and wild herbs, marjoram, lavish, or sometimes crushed juniper berries if they were lucky enough to have them. The marinade gave them flavor and kept the meat from drying out. Then came the boiling, slow, rhythmic, bubbling in large earthen pots. Once tender, they were dredged in flour or left plain and dropped into smoking pans of pig fat, where they popped and curled like angry snakes. The air filled with the scent of scorched skin and spiced flesh, the sound of hissing lard echoing against soot-blackened walls. Even in the gloom of a half-starved village kitchen, the necks shimmered with promise. On noble estates, the technique was refined, but no less primal. Records from the bishopric of Würzburg describe entire trays of chicken necks glazed in honey wine reductions, then laid out on bread slabs and finished with flecks of pepper and pine nuts. Served warm beside roasted root vegetables, they offered more than taste. They offered spectacle. Diners plucked them clean with fingers, teeth scraping bone, while servants wiped away the fat that streaked across their beards and sleeves. Then came the tongue, that strange, muscular organ both feared and revered. It was a symbol of speech, a metaphor for lies and blessings, and a rich, fibrous cut of meat wrapped in thick layers of gristle and skin. The ox tongue, in particular, was a delicacy of the patient. First, it was soaked overnight in cool water to draw out blood and soften the outer membrane. Then it was boiled with bay leaf, onion, and parsley for hours, until it softened enough to peel. At this stage, it was already edible, but that wasn't enough. The peeled tongue was pressed flat, rubbed with coarse salt and wine vinegar, and laid upon iron grates over open flame. The outside crisped and blistered, while the inside steamed itself into buttery tenderness. Carved crosswise into thick medallions, it was served with spiced mustard, or a glaze of wine and marrow fat. The result was complex, the outer layer slightly bitter, the center deep and velvety, the flavor somewhere between roast beef and liver, with an aftertaste of blood. In siege kitchens, necks and tongues were treated more frugally. Offal was boiled in bulk, pressed into jars, or mixed with barley mash to form cold jellies. Sometimes they were fried directly in their own drippings, seasoned only with salt and the occasional leaf of sage. But even in these stripped-down forms they mattered. The fat gave strength, the texture gave comfort, and the ritual, the act of preparing these unlikely cuts, connected cooks and soldiers, monks and mothers, to a deeper chain of necessity. Psychologically, these meals served a purpose far beyond hunger. In the letters of a German mercenary during the Hussite Wars, he recounts sitting alone beneath a torn canvas, biting into a tongue still warm from the fire, feeling it slide against his teeth and sink into his chest like heat. He writes of the silence it brought, the grounding weight of its fat, and how for a moment it drove out the fear of dawn. Food as armor, not for the body alone, but for the soul. The symbolism wasn't lost on chroniclers either. A 13th-century Bohemian text recounts a feast in which each knight was given a roasted ox tongue to sharpen his own. It was a nod to the power of words, to the belief that the tongue, once consumed, might lend clarity or fire to a warrior's voice. Peasants, too, found meaning in these parts. Children would gnaw at fried chicken necks like candy. Elders praised the marrow of split vertebrae as a balm for aching joints. And in the colder regions of Silesia and Livonia, tongues were preserved in brine and wrapped in smoked animal skins, hung from rafters like trophies of resilience. In every class, in every corner of Europe, the neck and tongue represented more than meat. They were the edible echoes of survival, rich in irony, blood, and the will to transform the unlovely into the unforgettable. There were two smells in a medieval kitchen: burnt fat and something older, darker, woven into stone and wood. Yet in the middle of this haze, amid the animal grease and smoke-blackened walls, a sudden wisp of rosemary or mint could change everything. A single green sprig plunged into bubbling lard might shift the mood from despair to warmth. The bitter odor of survival softened into something almost sacred. This pairing of herb and fat wasn't culinary flourish. It was necessity sharpened by centuries of hunger, rot, and prayer. Fat alone was vital. It was energy, insulation, and flavor in a world that knew none of these in abundance. But animal fat, especially when reheated, released a heavy stench, thick, clinging, impossible to forget. For people living elbow-deep in butchery and fire, the odor became part of the background. Yet there remained an instinctive resistance to it, a discomfort that medieval cooks learned to manage with leaves, flowers, and stalks pulled from earth and hedgerow. The addition of herbs was not indulgence, it was strategy. In peasant homes, bundles of sage, thyme, or lavish hung from the rafters, drying slowly in the smoke rising from the hearth. These were not luxuries but tools of balance, gathered from fields and forest edges when the season allowed, and stored for times when the cold flattened taste and the meat turned. Women wrapped wild mint in cloth and set it beside lard tubs to hold off spoilage. Boys pressed crushed oregano into clay jars of goose fat. The logic was clear. If fat couldn't be avoided, it had to be guided. The preparation was simple but careful. Once pork drippings or marrow grease were heated to clarity, herbs were stirred in slowly, sometimes whole, sometimes mashed in wooden mortars until their oils bled into the liquid. The aroma changed almost instantly. Sharp notes of pine, bitter green, citrus, and earth began to rise with the steam. Bread crusts were dipped into it, neck meat and sausage were soaked. In this haze of oil and herb, a new kind of food was born, not merely edible, but comforting, grounding, survivable. In war camps, the practice took on ritual significance. A bowl of fried pork and sage might be passed down a line of archers as dawn broke. In the final hours before a siege, roasted barley was drenched in herb-laced lard and swallowed with the same solemnity as a prayer. Chroniclers of the 13th century describe kitchens where even the absence of meat could be masked by the scent of thyme sizzling in fat. Guillaume de Nangy tells of a night where an army starved until a cook added mint and garlic to boiling grease, creating nothing more than a broth. but it gave the men enough resolve to march. It wasn't just flavor. Modern studies of ceramic cooking pots from sites in Bologna and Krakow show traces of thymol and carvacrol, antimicrobial compounds found in thyme and oregano. In practical terms, herbs didn't just smell better, they extended the shelf life of food, killing off bacteria in a time when every extra day of preservation could mean the difference between health and hunger. Even in ignorance, medieval cooks were chemists, crafting survival through instinct and repetition. Monastic records often framed this herb-fat union in terms of spiritual medicine. According to Benedictine dietary guides, hot and wet foods like grease had to be balanced with cool and dry ones like sage or savory. It was believed that too much untempered fat would agitate the humors and cloud the mind. To protect both body and soul, monks might chew fennel or rub meat with crushed hyssop. Eating was never simply consumption. It was negotiation with nature's volatility. Not all attempts succeeded. Parsley and dill, when scorched, turned acrid and intensified the smell of old meat. Tarragon combined with animal butter caused dizziness, at least according to the Chronicles of Mantua, where a monk claimed such a mixture made soldiers see demons in the firelight. But mistakes didn't erase the value of the method. They refined it. Slowly, regional traditions emerged. Juniper smoked pork fat in German markets, mint-infused lard in southern France, or sage-thickened grease sold as tavern fare in the alleys of York. Even among peasants, the effects were understood. In Worcestershire, a product called smoking pickle, lard cured with ash, herbs, and beechwood smoke, was cut into blocks and traded as a kind of edible soap. In siege towns, soldiers were issued rations of goose fat spiced with lavender or wild onion. One mercenary, writing from the Alpine passes, swore that fried thyme in fat could drive the chill from the bones faster than wine or prayer. It's tempting to view these meals through a modern lens and laugh at their simplicity or recoil at their rawness. But in that green swirl of oil and leaf was a revelation: how to transform death's smell into something human. Fat was the fuel of toil, and herbs, the memory of fields still in bloom. It didn't whisper, it roared. Before it was seen, before it was touched, it was smelled, an overwhelming sour wave that rolled through cloisters and corridors, slipping under doors and clinging to tapestries. This was not decay, this was prestige. The reek of a well-aged medieval cheese could stagger a monk at 50 paces and halt a dinner guest in mid-blessing. Yet it remained, proudly and defiantly, the centerpiece of elite tables from the Pyrenees to the plains of Bohemia. The stinkier it was, the closer to nobility you stood. Unlike fresh farmer's curd, these were cheeses meant to wait. Crafted by shepherds in alpine meadows or monks in cold stone cellars, their strength lay in their time. Thick loaves of pressed goat or sheep milk, sometimes aged for months in musty sheds, were salted and turned daily to coax the growth of mold. White, blue, green, sometimes the ominous gray that signaled the birth of a truly powerful rind. And the smell that bloomed from these rinds was no accident. It was a statement of age, of wealth, and of the body's willingness to endure excess. In the abbeys of Cluny and Reichenau, scribes recorded the exact rhythms of cheese-making. Milk from animals weary with seasonal birth was collected, warmed gently, and curdled using dried strips of a lamb's stomach lining. Once separated from its whey, the curd was salted by hand, formed into dense wheels, and set upon slatted wooden shelves. The air did the rest. In time, the surfaces cracked and rippled, growing skins that shimmered with oily sheen and musky promise. These were no dairy delights, they were edible relics. Hugh of Cluny, writing in the 11th century, described the aroma of a mature wheel as holy and violent, noting that the monks were permitted to consume it only in winter, when the body needed warmth and the spirit could endure temptation. Medicinal texts from the same period agreed. Aged cheese was considered hot and dry, a natural balance to the damp melancholy of cold months. It was, in theory, a food that warmed the blood and cleared the mind. In practice, it often stunned the senses. Aristocrats, eager to show off their refinement and daring, included such cheeses in the final course of feasts. Placed on polished pewter plates and accompanied by sprigs of basil, thyme, or rose petals, the cheeses were announced by servants with downcast eyes. Guests braced themselves. The bolder among them sliced a wedge, inhaled, and proclaimed its excellence. The weaker souls recoiled, some even gagged, especially when the cheese arrived oozing with melted fat and marbled with veins of gray fungus. It was not unusual for the rich to weep slightly while eating it, half from flavor, half from the burning in their sinuses. In cities like Bruges and Chartres, cheesemongers specialized in transporting the funeral cheeses of Burgundy and the goat bricks of Languedoc. Their cost often doubled that of fresh meat, not because of rarity, but because of ritual. The power of the smell was more than chemical, it was political. To endure such food proved something: that you were strong enough to handle the rot of life and refined enough to pretend it was divine. The more the cheese assaulted the senses, the greater the prestige. A bishop once noted, half in jest, that only the damned refused to taste it. In courtly circles, failing to appreciate a strong cheese was a mark of rusticity. Yet in the countryside, peasants consumed similar products not as luxuries, but as necessity. Their versions lacked the delicate timing or imported molds.